free messenger. Okay, beautiful.
Dear Mr. Good, could you describe us in some sentences your normal everyday life in Connecticut?
Before Plagge or after Plagge?
Perhaps before Plagge and after Plagge.
Okay. Well, before Plagge, I would get up at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, help chase my children out of bed and get them started to school, make their school lunches, start the coffee because we can't do anything without the coffee. And then usually by 8 o'clock or 8:30, I leave for the hospital. If I have any patients who are in the hospital, I make rounds and see them. And then by 9 o'clock, I'm supposed to be at my office, but I'm always a little bit late. I usually get there around 9:15. And then I work until at the office at a fairly hectic pace until usually 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And then I come home at 7 o'clock, have dinner with my family, and by 10 or 11 o'clock, I'm in bed. Usually I do my email correspondence first thing in the morning, around 6 or 6:30 to 7. So it's always very crazy in the morning. I'm trying to get the kids up and screaming at them to get out of bed and get dressed and making their sandwiches and running to the computer and checking my email. After Plagge, I began to get up earlier, frequently getting up at maybe 5 or 5:30 in the morning and really trying to do 2 hours of concentrated work and correspondence and research, and then later writing. When I began to write the book, I had started to swim in the mornings, and there's a lake near our house, and I would go to the lake and I would swim across the lake and back, and I would write the chapters as I swam, and I would come home and start typing.
So it's the life of a real American family doctor, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. I mean, the life of a family physician in the United States is fairly hectic. I'll usually see maybe between 30 and 34 patients a day, and maybe have 30 or 40 telephone messages that I have to deal with, and then interruptions from the emergency room and from the hospital wards, and then calling patients who have questions. So during the day, once I go to work, I have to really concentrate on work. And sometimes emails would come from Marianne and Jorg and Solomon in the middle of my day, and I would get, it was so tempting because I knew that there was this very interesting thing, but you're running so fast that you don't really have time. So then I would study it late at night. Sometimes during lunch hour I would take a peek and see what treasures had arrived.
Did you talk to your patients, to your clients in the practice about your research?
Oh yeah. No, there have been some local newspaper stories about it, and they're very interested. They think it's a very interesting story, and they knew that I was writing the book, and so they've all been saying, "When's the book coming? When's your book coming?" So they're very excited about this too.
Are there any survivors or family members of survivors of the Holocaust in your practice?
No, there's no Holocaust survivors, but there's a big group of elderly men in their 80s who served in the American Army in Europe, and many of them liberated some of the concentration camps, and they're very they're very glad that some of these stories that they witnessed and the issues that because they said when they came home nobody believed what they saw, and they were. I remember one of my patients was saying, one of his friends, they were at a party, years later, saying, I don't believe it, they didn't kill, that many people. It's all, a story, exaggeration. And he was yelling at the guy, I was there, I saw it, and don't, until you go there and saw what I saw, don't you ever say something like that again. So there's a lot of people who have various ties. They had a father who was in the army. They had a neighbor who was a survivor. People have there's so many ties that go back to World War II. Even the United States, which was much more remote. I mean, whenever I come here to Europe, I'm very struck how the continent is still recovering from World War II. This was one of the things when I was traveling in 1999. The war was still very fresh in people's minds. It was such a cataclysmic event that everywhere I went, I saw traces of the war, and people were rebuilding Warsaw, and Krakow still wasn't rebuilt. And in Italy, the village where my wife's mother comes from, there were 20 people shot in retribution for a partisan shooting, and they have named a street called the 24th of April, because this was the day that these men were killed. And every villager in the family had somebody who died, and every year they commemorate them, and it was the biggest event that had ever happened to this village. So everywhere I went, Warsaw, Italy, Germany, but even in the United States, where the war never touched our shores, enough family members, friends, people still think about it.
So what did the term Jewish identity mean to you, or what does it mean to you?
When I was growing up, there was a very large chasm between my parents and their thick accents and all their friends who spoke all these languages that I could never understand, and all these terrible stories, and then the rest of carefree America, driving around in their convertibles and going to the beach and looking at the girls in bikinis, and I remember as a child, I was, and I think this is true of many immigrants, very embarrassed that my parents were not as adept as with American culture as the rest of my family. For instance, we went to a school function, and at the beginning of the school function, everybody stands up and they sing the national anthem. And I looked over at my father, and I could see, to my horror, that he didn't know the words to the national anthem. And I was, scared that the other people would notice that my father didn't, know the words to this song. Or when we went to play, to watch a baseball game, he had no idea about baseball, and when he and I would try to play catch with the ball, he didn't know how to throw a baseball. He could kick a soccer ball, but nobody, that wasn't okay. Who cared about, soccer? So I felt that, that my parents, weren't adept and comfortable with the local culture. And when you're a child or a teenager, you very much want to fit in, to be like everybody else. So I spent I think for a long time I was interested in being like everybody else. And there were very few Jews in our community in Southern California, maybe a class of 30, maybe 1 or 2 would be Jewish. And everything I knew about Judaism was, just horrible stories and boring Hebrew school. So I didn't have a lot of interest in it. And as time went on, and I got more involved in college and politics, and I was a political science major, and then I decided I wanted to go to medical school and studied all the sciences and went to study medicine. I left more and more of that behind, and I really was not interested in synagogue and prayers. It really didn't touch me at all. But I think over time, I began to realize as I was an adult that my parents had real values, that they really knew what was important and what was silly. And in America, a lot of people put a lot of energy into stupidity or into silly things. And I began to appreciate that my parents really understood that appearances weren't that important, and that how you conducted yourself was. And so, I think as everybody gets into their 20s, they start to look at their parents and see that, maybe maybe there's more than I give them credit for.
How would you define now a Jewish identity, or your Jewish identity?
Yeah. In terms of a Jewish identity, I'm not a religious person, and for a long time I thought that I was agnostic, but actually since reading Karl Plagge's letters, he's a very insightful man, and he has this passage where he says that if we live in a world that worships death and would even gas children, then perhaps if there is a God, it would be better for him if we didn't believe in him. And I think that pretty much finally put into words my feelings about religion and God. That if there's a God who would allow these kinds of things to happen, then he's not for me. On the other hand, I do think that the Jewish religion, if you strip away all the worship of God, is very much centered on making the world a better place. And there is no afterlife. The world is what we make of it. And our duty as Jews is to perform mitzvah, to do good deeds. Now, for the religious Jews, many of the mitzvah are keeping the kosher laws and all the rituals. But really, the most important thing is doing good in this world. And the idea that the Messiah will come, or will come to the Messianic age, when there are enough people doing enough good deeds to light up the world. And that I believe in very much, that this world is what we humans make of it. And we have it now. The afterlife is, who knows? I mean, I personally think that I will go into the ground and turn back into carbon and water. So, the world that we leave our children is what we make of the world, and that requires people doing good deeds. And I think that that's a very strong message that comes from the Jewish tradition.
Michael, there are quite different characters and ways of helping the victims among the people who saved Jews. What do you think was special about Karl Plagge?
Well, I think that he was in a very unique situation. It's not too often that you have a staff officer in the Wehrmacht who wants to help Jews. I mean, how often does that happen? So here you have a man in a unique position who has this motivation, and yet he's a cautious man. He's a clever man, and I think that he tried not to take risks and get himself killed. Um, so I think what was special about him was that, one, he was in this unique position, and he figured out how to protect Jews in large numbers. Most of the rescuers were individuals, and most of them were members of the occupied, populations who viewed the Germans as the enemy. And so there's not that many Germans who, while serving the German army and doing their duty, also wanted to try to subvert this one aspect of the war. So I think it's he's a unique man. Unique man. I mean, he did not. I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether his actions were overtly treasonous, or whether he actually did support his country and did his duty and protected his men, and also did this very important task of protecting these 1,000 Jewish workers. So I think that it's a very unique case. He wasn't hiding a Jew under his bed, or helping transport him out, to a smuggler to take him out of town. I mean, most people worked on the individual level, and he was in a position to work on a more organizational level, and this, I think, was very unusual.
Michael, your wife is a Roman Catholic of Italian origin, and you have 2 children in teenager age. So how do your wife and your children see your intensive involvement in sort of Holocaust research?
Well, I think that they understand that this is a overwhelming part of our family history. That we have a very unusual family with a very amazing family story, and that we all need to be very grateful for being alive. And I've tried very hard to segregate. See, I'm the first one in the house to wake up in the morning, so I try to do the majority of my work early in the morning at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. when they're all asleep. And on weekends, they sleep in till 9 or 10 o'clock. So I get up at the crack of dawn, and I'm working away on my days off from work and on the weekends. But I think that they are very, I think they're very proud that our family has been able to bring these stories and the lessons that come out of them to our community in Connecticut, and now I think to a larger group of listeners around the world.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, did your view of Germany, or your thinking about Germany and the Germans change throughout your search?
Profoundly. Previously, when I had, I used to have these very anxious feelings about anybody who was German. If somebody was my parents' age, I immediately wondered, if they were perpetrators of the genocide. If people were younger, I wondered, well, maybe their parents or grandparents were the people who murdered my families. And I found it very difficult to interact with anybody from Germany. I would get very nervous and sweaty, and it was difficult. What the course of this research has done is several things. First of all, I've come to understand that a German, Karl Plagge, was an extremely forthright and moral man, and he saved my family's life and gave life to me and my children. What's more, the people that I've met in the course of my search here in Germany, I would have gotten nowhere without Solomon Klasko, Jörg Fiebelkorn, Marianne Wiefhaus. I was for 14 months I was writing and writing and writing and getting nowhere. And until they came to my assistance out of the goodness of their heart and the generosity of their spirit, I would have had no understanding at all of any of the, I would have had no answers to any of the questions. So their, generous spirits has made a big impression on me. And finally, when I have been looking at Karl Plagge and his story, as well as the story of his soldiers and his men, I've been forced to look at these events and the decisions that ordinary Germans had to make. And I have to ask myself, well, what do we expect of an average person drafted into the army, sent to the east, and then confronted with orders after having been indoctrinated for 10 years that these were the enemies of our race and that it was our difficult task to try to free ourselves from this terrible Jewish conspiracy. So I've had to put myself in their shoes, and I realized that for the average German soldier, it was not easy to know what the right thing to do was. I think it's much less black and white in my mind that these weren't a nation of evildoers. That there certainly were big evildoers in the Nazi Party, and they gained power and they propagated all this propaganda. But when I judge the individual Germans, I can see that it's much more difficult to know, well, what exactly, if somebody didn't want to risk their life, and who wants to risk their life? Nobody wants to risk their life. What exactly did I expect them to do? And I'm not sure what I expect them to do. I don't know what I would do if I were in their shoes. So I think I have much more sympathy for the dilemmas and difficult circumstances that millions of German men found themselves in.
And this brings us to the last question. What do you think are the actual the implications now of that what Karl Plagge did during the Holocaust?
Well, I see two main things. One is that when we look at how did he come to act in such a different way, so different from everybody else? What I've decided is that he didn't rely on his leaders to show him the path, and he didn't look to his fellow soldiers and peers to decide what the right thing to do was. Because this is what most of us do. Most of us follow our leaders. We look to our left and our right to see what everybody else is doing. And he didn't. He looked inside himself and decided, based on his own moral conscience, his inner moral compass, whether he thought things were right or wrong. And that is why he was able to take such a different course. He said, these people, these leaders are criminals, and my fellow Germans are morally corrupt in what they're doing, and I won't do it. And so I think this is the main reason that I think I'm alive, is that this man looked inside. And I also think that he wasn't a big fist-waving, rifle-toting hero, and I was very taken by a line that he wrote to Attorney Strauss in 1956, when he wrote, "I am no hero. I'm basically a very nervous person," and I read that, and I thought that this was a very important line, because he inside feels like many of us feel, that we're not braver than average, that we're actually very nervous. And yet a man who felt like that was able to carefully look at his situation and cautiously manipulate the system. And doing this in a cautious and risk-avoiding manner, but understanding what he wanted to happen, he was able to do great things. And I think that it should encourage all of us who are nervous and meek that we too can change the world for the better.